Welcome back, dear listener, to another soft-spoken stroll through the shadows of the past. Whether the night is just beginning for you or you're listening as sleep slowly arrives, I'm happy you've chosen to spend this time here with me. Let me know in the comments. Are you listening from somewhere far and quiet, or in the heart of a busy city winding down? And if these calming explorations bring a sense of rest, please consider subscribing. There are countless more voices from the past still waiting to be heard. Now, settle back into your favorite chair, close your eyes if you wish, and let your mind drift back to a time when power was measured not in votes or wealth alone, but in bloodlines, marriages, and the precarious balance of medieval politics. Tonight, we explore what life was truly like for the queens of the Middle Ages. Not the romanticized figures of fairy tales, but real women navigating a world that was often as dangerous as it was magnificent. Picture, if you will, a young woman of perhaps 14 or 15 years old. She has been raised in a castle, certainly, surrounded by luxury that most of her subjects could never imagine. Yet as she stands before a mirror of polished silver, being dressed by her ladies-in-waiting, she knows that her life is not truly her own. Her marriage has been arranged since she was a child, a political alliance sealed with her body and her future. She may never have met her husband-to-be, may not even speak his language, yet in a few hours or days, she will become a queen in a foreign land. This was the reality for countless medieval queens. Marriage was rarely about love or even compatibility. It was diplomacy by other means. Take Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of the 12th century. At 15, she was married to Louis VII of France, a union that was supposed to strengthen both realms. But Eleanor was no passive pawn. She was intelligent, educated, and possessed of a strong will that would shape the politics of Europe for decades. Yet even Eleanor, for all her power and influence, lived within constraints that would seem suffocating to us today. Medieval queens were expected to be pious, modest, and above all, fertile. Their primary duty was to produce male heirs to secure the succession. The pressure was immense. Failure to bear children, or worse, bearing only daughters, could lead to accusations of divine displeasure, political instability, or even annulment. Consider the daily routine of a medieval queen. She would wake before dawn, not to birdsong in a peaceful garden, but to the sound of servants preparing for the elaborate rituals that governed royal life. Her every movement was choreographed, from the order in which she dressed to the ceremonies she attended. Privacy was virtually non-existent. Even her bedchamber was often filled with ladies-in-waiting, courtiers, and servants. The morning would begin with prayers, for medieval queens were expected to be paragons of Christian virtue. They would attend Mass, sometimes multiple times per day, and their religious devotions were as much a matter of public display as private faith. After prayers came the complex business of holding court, receiving petitioners, and managing the intricate web of relationships that kept a medieval kingdom functioning. But perhaps most challenging of all was the constant scrutiny. Every word a queen spoke, every gesture she made, every person she favoured or dismissed was analysed for political meaning. She lived her life on a stage, always performing the role of queenship, rarely able to simply be herself. The slightest misstep could trigger rumours, conspiracies, or worse. Medieval queens also faced unique dangers that their male counterparts rarely encountered. Childbirth was perilous in an age before modern medicine, and queens were expected to risk their lives repeatedly to secure the succession. Many died young, worn out by constant pregnancies and the stress of their position. Those who survived often found themselves vulnerable to accusations of witchcraft or adultery if they failed to produce the desired heirs. Yet within these constraints, many medieval queens found ways to wield real power and influence. They became patrons of the arts, founding monasteries and commissioning great works of literature and architecture. They served as regents for their minor children, ruling kingdoms in their own right. Some, like Matilda of Tuscany or Eleanor of Aquitaine, even led armies into battle. The court itself was a complex ecosystem that queens had to navigate with skill and cunning. Surrounded by nobles who might be allies one day and enemies the next, they had to master the subtle arts of diplomacy, knowing when to show favor and when to withhold it, when to speak and when to remain silent. A medieval queen's survival often depended on her ability to read the shifting currents of court politics and position herself accordingly. As our imaginary young queen goes through her daily rituals, attended by servants whose loyalty she can never be entirely certain of, she embodies both the privileges and the burdens of medieval queenship. She may wear cloth of gold and dine from silver plates, but she's also a prisoner of her position, her life shaped by forces beyond her control. This, then, was the reality behind the crown, not the fairy tale of happily ever after, but a complex, often difficult existence where survival required intelligence, adaptability, and no small measure of courage. In the episodes to come, we'll delve deeper into these remarkable women's lives, exploring their struggles, their triumphs, and the indelible mark they left on history. For now, let these images settle in your mind as you drift towards sleep. The rustle of silk gowns on stone floors, the flicker of candlelight on ancient walls, and the quiet strength of women who shaped the course of nations from within the gilded constraints of medieval queenship. Part 2. The daily grind of royal life. As the first rays of dawn crept through the ornate windows of the castle, Queen Isabella stirred from her slumber. But this was no gentle awakening to a life of leisure that many might imagine. Instead, it marked the beginning of another day bound by rigid protocols, endless ceremonies, and the suffocating weight of constant observation. The medieval Queen's Day began not with personal choice, but with the inexorable demands of court ritual. Before she could even dress, a procession of ladies-in-waiting would enter her chambers, each with their prescribed role in the elaborate morning ceremony. The simple act of getting dressed became a choreographed performance, with specific nobles holding the honor of presenting each garment. The Queen could not simply reach for her favorite gown. Every piece of clothing had been selected according to the day's scheduled events, the season, the political climate, and what message the royal wardrobe was meant to convey. Consider the morning routine of Eleanor of Aquitaine during her time as Queen of France. Even as one of the most powerful women in medieval Europe, her day began at dawn with prayers in her private chapel, followed by the formal dressing ceremony that could take over an hour. The weight of her ceremonial robes, heavy with gold thread and precious stones, served as a constant physical reminder of her position's burdens. These garments weren't chosen for comfort or personal preference, but as statements of royal authority and divine appointment. The Queen's breakfast, too, was far from a private affair. Even this most basic human need became a public spectacle, with designated courtiers whose sole purpose was to oversee the royal meal. Food tasters ensured her safety, but also meant that every bite was observed, analysed, and reported upon. The Queen couldn't simply enjoy her food. She had to be conscious that her appetite, her preferences, even her manner of eating would be discussed throughout the court and potentially interpreted as signs of her health, mood, or political leanings. The morning audience was perhaps the most grueling part of the daily routine. Queens were expected to hold court, receiving petitioners, hearing grievances, and making decisions that affected countless lives. But unlike a modern executive who might have advisors and time to deliberate, the medieval queen was expected to demonstrate wisdom and justice on the spot, often in matters of life and death. These weren't ceremonial duties. They were real responsibilities that carried enormous consequences. Take Queen Matilda of England, who during her contested reign in the 12th century would spend hours each morning hearing cases from nobles disputing land rights, merchants seeking trade privileges, and commoners requesting royal intervention in local disputes. Each decision had to balance competing interests while maintaining the delicate web of alliances that kept her in power. A single poorly judged ruling could spark a rebellion or lose the support of crucial allies. The administrative burden was crushing. Medieval queens weren't merely figureheads. They were expected to understand the complex financial systems of their kingdoms, manage vast household staffs, oversee the education and marriages of noble children placed in their care, and maintain correspondence with other royal courts across Europe. Queen Blanche of Castile, mother of Louis IX of France, regularly worked through documents until well past midnight, managing everything from military supplies to monastery endowments. The physical toll of this lifestyle was severe. Queens were constantly on display, required to maintain perfect posture and composure, even when suffering from illness or personal grief. They couldn't show weakness, couldn't have bad days, couldn't even scratch an itch without it being noted and potentially misinterpreted. The elaborate court dress, while magnificent, was also a form of physical constraint, with tight bodices, heavy fabrics, and restrictive undergarments that made even basic movement challenging. Privacy was a luxury that simply didn't exist. Queens were accompanied at all times by ladies-in-waiting, guards, and various court officials. They couldn't take a walk alone, couldn't write a letter without it being potentially intercepted and read, couldn't have a private conversation without risking it being overheard and reported. Even their most intimate moments were subject to scrutiny. Royal pregnancies were matters of state, with court physicians monitoring every aspect of the Queen's health, and even the timing of conception being planned according to political needs. The emotional isolation was perhaps the cruelest aspect of royal life. Queens were surrounded by people all day, yet genuine friendship was nearly impossible. Every person who approached them wanted something: favour, advancement, protection, or simply the prestige of royal attention. True confidants were rare and dangerous. Trusting the wrong person could lead to political ruin or even death. Many queens developed close relationships with their confessors, as these were among the few people bound by religious vows to keep their secrets. Queen Marguerite of Provence, wife of Louis IX, wrote in her private prayers about the terrible solitude of the crown, describing how she was constantly surrounded by people yet felt utterly alone. She couldn't share her fears about her children's health with anyone without it becoming a matter of state concern. She couldn't express doubts about political decisions without undermining royal authority. She couldn't even grieve properly when she lost children in infancy, as royal mourning had to be conducted according to strict protocols. The pressure to produce male heirs added another layer of stress to daily life. Queens understood that their primary value lay in their ability to provide succession, and each month that passed without pregnancy was a month closer to potential political disaster. The medieval understanding of conception placed the responsibility entirely on the woman, so infertility, or the birth of daughters, was seen as the Queen's personal failure. This biological pressure intersected with political necessity in ways that modern people can barely comprehend. Isabella of France, Queen to Edward II of England, endured years of speculation about her inability to conceive early in her marriage. Court physicians subjected her to humiliating examinations, prescribed treatments that ranged from uncomfortable to dangerous, and constantly monitored her menstrual cycles. When she finally became pregnant, every aspect of her pregnancy was managed by a team of doctors, midwives, and court officials who saw her not as a person, but as a vessel for the future of the kingdom. The Queen's relationships with their own children were complicated by the demands of royal life. Children were often raised primarily by wet nurses and tutors, with queens seeing them mainly during formal occasions. Royal children weren't just beloved offspring. They were political assets to be educated, married off, and deployed in service of dynastic goals. The maternal instinct to protect and nurture had to be balanced against the political necessity of using children to cement alliances and secure the kingdom's future. Even leisure activities were constrained by royal expectations. Queens couldn't simply pursue hobbies they enjoyed. Their interests had to align with royal dignity and political messaging. They were expected to be accomplished in music, literature, and needlework, not for personal fulfillment, but because these skills demonstrated royal cultivation and could be displayed to visiting dignitaries. Hunting, one of the few physical activities available to noble women, came with elaborate protocols about when, where, and with whom the queen could participate. The constant performance was exhausting. Every gesture, every expression, every word was scrutinized for meaning. Queens had to master the art of saying nothing while appearing to say everything, of showing interest without commitment, of displaying emotion without losing control. They were trained from childhood to be living symbols rather than authentic human beings. Religious obligations added yet another layer to the daily burden. Queens were expected to be models of Christian virtue, attending multiple daily services, participating in religious festivals, and demonstrating piety through charitable works. But even their relationship with God was public and political. Their prayers were observed, their charitable donations calculated for maximum political benefit, and their religious devotions used to enhance royal legitimacy. The administrative work alone was staggering. Queens managed household budgets that would dwarf modern corporations, oversaw staffs of hundreds of people, and maintained complex networks of patronage and obligation. They had to understand law, finance, diplomacy, and military strategy well enough to make informed decisions. Yet they received little formal education in these areas. Most learned through observation and experience, often making costly mistakes while the kingdom watched. Despite all these constraints, many medieval queens found ways to exercise real power and influence. They learned to work within the system's limitations, using their positions to advance causes they believed in, protect vulnerable subjects, and sometimes even challenge royal policies they disagreed with. But this influence came at the cost of any semblance of a normal human life. The tragedy of the medieval queen's existence was that in gaining a crown, she lost herself. The woman beneath the royal regalia was often forgotten, buried under layers of protocol, expectation, and political necessity. Yet understanding this reality helps us appreciate the remarkable resilience and intelligence of the women who not only survived this system, but sometimes managed to thrive within it, leaving lasting impacts on their kingdoms and on history itself. Their daily lives were a constant negotiation between personal desires and public duties, between human needs and royal obligations, between the woman they might have been and the queen they were required to be. In this tension lay both the source of their power and the seed of their suffering, creating lives of magnificent complexity that challenge our modern assumptions about medieval queenship. Looking at the content you've provided and the context of continuing from where you left off, here's part 3 of your 12-part script about medieval queens. But even as queens navigated these treacherous political waters, their most fundamental duty remained brutally simple: produce a male heir. This biological imperative cast a shadow over every aspect of their existence, transforming their bodies into vessels for dynastic survival and their wombs into battlegrounds where the fate of kingdoms hung in the balance. The pressure to conceive began immediately after marriage, often when these queens were still teenagers themselves. Court physicians, astrologers, and midwives scrutinized every aspect of their health, diet, and behavior. They were fed special foods believed to encourage conception, subjected to bloodletting to balance their humors, and forced to endure treatments that ranged from the merely uncomfortable to the genuinely dangerous. Holy relics were placed beneath their beds, prayers were offered at shrines, and pilgrimages were undertaken, all in service of the desperate hope for pregnancy. When conception did occur, the Queen's life became even more regimented and observed. Her every movement was monitored, her diet carefully controlled, and her activities severely restricted. She was surrounded by female attendants, whose job it was to ensure nothing went wrong during the precious months of pregnancy. The fate of the realm literally grew within her belly, and everyone knew it. But pregnancy in the medieval period was a death sentence for many women. Without modern medical knowledge or sterile conditions, complications were common and often fatal. Queens died in childbirth at alarming rates, their lives sacrificed on the altar of dynastic necessity. Even those who survived the birth faced the heartbreak of infant mortality, which claimed the lives of countless royal children before they reached their first birthday. Consider the tragic case of Jane Seymour, Henry VIII's third wife. She finally gave Henry the male heir he so desperately craved, but died of complications just 12 days after giving birth to the future Edward VI. Her triumph in producing a son became her death warrant, and her brief moment of fulfilling her primary duty as queen came at the ultimate cost. The psychological toll of these expectations cannot be overstated. Queens who failed to conceive or who produced only daughters lived under constant threat of divorce, annulment, or worse. They watched their husbands take mistresses, knowing that any bastard son could potentially threaten their own position. They endured the whispers of courtiers who blamed them for the kingdom's lack of a male heir, as if the sex of their children was somehow under their control. Catherine of Aragon experienced this torture for decades. Married to Henry VIII for over 20 years, she endured multiple pregnancies, miscarriages, and stillbirths. Only one child, Mary, survived to adulthood. The king's frustration with her failure to produce a son ultimately led to the English Reformation, as Henry broke with Rome to divorce Catherine and marry Anne Boleyn. Catherine spent her final years in exile, stripped of her title and separated from her daughter, all because her body had failed to produce the male heir that politics demanded. Anne Boleyn herself would face the same impossible pressure. Despite her intelligence, wit, and political acumen, her inability to give Henry a son sealed her fate. After producing only Elizabeth, she too was cast aside, though her end was far more dramatic and violent than Catherine's lonely exile. The executioner's sword that ended her life was, in many ways, the logical conclusion of a system that valued queens solely for their reproductive capacity. Even successful queens who did produce male heirs found their troubles far from over. Medieval medicine understood little about spacing pregnancies or women's health, so queens were expected to continue bearing children throughout their fertile years. Each pregnancy brought new risks, and the constant cycle of conception, pregnancy, birth, and recovery took a devastating toll on their bodies and minds. Isabella of Castile, one of history's most successful female rulers, bore 5 children, while simultaneously governing a kingdom and funding Christopher Columbus's voyages to the New World. The physical and emotional strain of constant pregnancy while managing affairs of state was immense, yet she had no choice but to continue. Her body belonged not to herself, but to the crown and the dynasty she served. The medieval understanding of women's bodies made these expectations even more burdensome. Medical texts of the time described women as essentially defective men, ruled by their unstable humors and prone to hysteria. When queens failed to conceive, it was often attributed to moral failings or divine displeasure rather than simple biology. They were subjected to increasingly desperate treatments, from special diets to painful procedures, all designed to correct what was seen as their fundamental inadequacy. The irony, of course, is that medieval science had no understanding of the male role in determining a child's sex. Queens were blamed for producing daughters when the father's contribution actually determines gender. countless women suffered disgrace, divorce, and death for a biological reality completely beyond their control. Yet even in this system designed to reduce them to breeding stock, some queens found ways to assert their agency and importance. They used their pregnancies as opportunities to negotiate for better treatment or political concessions. They carefully managed the timing of announcements to maximize political advantage. They surrounded themselves with loyal female networks that provided support and protection during their most vulnerable moments. Eleanor of Aquitaine, despite bearing 8 children across 2 marriages, never allowed motherhood to diminish her political power. She used her pregnancies strategically, ensuring that each child strengthened her position and expanded her influence. Even in her 70s, long past childbearing age, she remained a formidable political force, proving that a queen's value could extend far beyond her reproductive years. The constant pressure to produce heirs also created complex dynamics within royal families. Queens had to navigate not only their relationships with their husbands, but also with their children, stepchildren, and potential rivals. A queen who produced only daughters might find herself supplanted by a second wife, forcing her to watch her own children displaced in the succession. The emotional pain of seeing one's offspring marginalized for the sake of dynastic politics added another layer of suffering to an already difficult existence. These biological realities shaped every aspect of a medieval queen's daily life. Their clothing was designed for easy modification during pregnancy. Their diets were constantly monitored and adjusted based on their reproductive status. Their social activities were curtailed or expanded, depending on whether they were trying to conceive, pregnant, or recovering from childbirth. Their very identity was tied to the functioning of their reproductive system in ways that modern women would find suffocating. The documentation from the period reveals the intimate details of this biological surveillance. Court records meticulously tracked queens' menstrual cycles, noting when they were indisposed and calculating fertile periods. Letters between royal physicians discuss the most intimate details of queens' bodies, as if they were medical specimens rather than human beings. The complete lack of privacy around their reproductive health was just another way in which queens were denied basic human dignity. This intense focus on reproduction also meant that queens who couldn't or wouldn't bear children faced particular challenges. Some, like Elizabeth I, turned their unmarried state into a political asset, using the possibility of marriage as a diplomatic tool while maintaining their independence. Others, like Christina of Sweden, eventually abdicated rather than submit to the expectation of marriage and motherhood. These exceptional cases highlight just how unusual it was for a medieval queen to escape the biological demands of her position. The physical realities of medieval childbirth made these expectations even more daunting. Without proper sanitation, pain relief, or medical intervention, giving birth was genuinely life-threatening. Queens labored in rooms filled with attendants but lacking basic hygiene. They endured hours or days of agony with only herbal remedies for pain relief. Many died from infections, hemorrhaging, or complications that would be easily treatable today. Those who survived often faced lasting physical damage that affected them for the rest of their lives. Yet despite these overwhelming challenges, medieval queens found ways to create meaning and purpose within the constraints of their biological destiny. They became patrons of medicine and midwifery, funding research and training that helped other women. They established charitable institutions for mothers and children. They used their experiences of pregnancy and motherhood to connect with female subjects in ways that their male counterparts never could. The story of medieval queens' reproductive lives is ultimately one of resilience in the face of impossible expectations. Reduced to their biological function, yet expected to maintain dignity and grace, blamed for outcomes beyond their control yet required to continue trying, these women navigated a system designed to break them. That so many not only survived but thrived, finding ways to wield power and create lasting legacies despite these constraints, speaks to the extraordinary strength of the human spirit. Their struggles remind us that behind every crown and title was a woman facing the most fundamental challenges of human existence, often alone and always under scrutiny. The price of medieval queenship was measured not just in political compromise or personal sacrifice, but in the most intimate and painful aspects of human biology. Understanding this reality helps us appreciate both the limitations these women faced and the remarkable achievements they managed despite them. Boring history. What life was really like for medieval queens, Part 4. But perhaps nowhere was the precarious nature of medieval queenship more evident than in the realm of marriage and romantic love. While fairy tales and romantic literature have painted a picture of courtly love and chivalrous knights winning the hearts of fair maidens, the reality for medieval queens was far more calculated and often heartbreaking. Marriage for a medieval queen was never about personal choice or romantic attraction. It was a political chess move, a diplomatic treaty sealed with a ring and a wedding ceremony. From the moment a princess drew her first breath, her future husband was likely already being discussed in council chambers across Europe. These marriages were arranged to forge alliances, secure trade routes, end wars, or claim territories. The bride's feelings were not merely secondary, they were completely irrelevant. Consider the tragic case of Isabella of Valois, who became Queen of England at the tender age of 6. Yes, 6 years old. She was married to the 29-year-old King Richard II as part of a peace treaty between England and France. This child bride spent her wedding day playing with dolls, while diplomats celebrated the political advantages her marriage would bring. She would never truly know her husband, as Richard was deposed and likely murdered when Isabella was still just a child herself. Even when queens were old enough to understand their circumstances, they had no power to refuse their fate. Margaret of Anjou was 15 when she was betrothed to the mentally unstable King Henry VI of England. The marriage was arranged to secure an alliance between England and France, but Margaret found herself married to a man who would suffer from complete mental breakdowns, leaving her to essentially rule England, while caring for a husband who sometimes didn't even recognize her. She spent decades fighting civil wars to protect her son's inheritance, all while maintaining the fiction that her incapacitated husband was still capable of ruling. The emotional toll of these arranged marriages was devastating. Queens were expected to love, honor, and obey husbands they had never met. Men who were often decades older, sometimes cruel, and occasionally completely unsuitable as partners. They were required to share their beds with strangers, to bear children for men they might despise, and to smile graciously through it all, while representing the dignity of their royal houses. Many queens never saw their homelands again after marriage. They were shipped off to foreign courts where they didn't speak the language, didn't understand the customs, and had no allies. Anne of Cleves travelled from Germany to England to marry King Henry VIII, only to have him declare their marriage null and void after just 6 months because he found her physically unappealing. She spent the rest of her life in exile, neither married nor unmarried, completely dependent on the king's charity. The concept of romantic love, while celebrated in literature and song, was considered dangerous and inappropriate for royalty. Queens who showed too much affection for their husbands were viewed with suspicion, while those who sought love elsewhere faced accusations of adultery that could lead to execution. The court of love poetry and chivalric romance that we associate with medieval times was largely a fantasy, a literary escape from the harsh realities of political marriages and loveless unions. Some queens attempted to find emotional fulfillment through passionate friendships or spiritual devotion, but even these relationships were scrutinized and often used against them. Eleanor of Aquitaine's close relationships with various nobles and clergy were constantly questioned, and her fierce independence eventually led to her imprisonment by her own husband, King Henry II, for 16 years. The pressure to maintain a perfect marriage facade was enormous. Queens were expected to appear devoted to their husbands in public, regardless of how they were treated in private. They had to smile and play the part of the happy wife, even when their husbands took mistresses, spent their dowries on wars, or treated them with open contempt. Any sign of marital discord was seen as a failure of the queen's duty and could be used to justify setting her aside. When marriages failed, it was almost always the queen who suffered the consequences. Kings could seek annulments, claim their wives were barren, or simply take new wives while imprisoning or executing the old ones. Queens had no such options. They could not divorce, could not remarry, and could not return to their families without causing international incidents. They were trapped in marriages that were often little more than gilded cages. The rare queens who did find genuine love faced their own unique challenges. When they married for love rather than politics, they were criticized for putting personal desires above royal duty. Their children's legitimacy might be questioned, their political alliances weakened, and their reputations destroyed. Love, for a medieval queen, was not a blessing, but a dangerous liability that could destroy everything she had worked to build. Even widowhood, which might seem like freedom, brought its own restrictions. Widowed queens were valuable marriage pawns once again, their experience and connections making them attractive to ambitious nobles seeking to advance their political fortunes. Many were forced into second or third marriages against their will, their periods of mourning cut short by political necessity. The emotional isolation experienced by medieval queens was profound and lasting. They lived surrounded by people, but were truly intimate with no one. Their ladies-in-waiting were potential spies. Their confessors reported to the church hierarchy, and their children were often raised by others and viewed primarily as political assets. Even their most private moments were subject to scrutiny, their correspondence read, their movements monitored, and their conversations reported back to their husbands or their husbands' advisors. This isolation was compounded by the fact that queens were often foreigners in their adopted lands, forever marked as outsiders regardless of how long they lived there or how well they served their new countries. They were expected to completely abandon their native cultures, languages, and customs, while never being fully accepted by their new subjects. They existed in a permanent state of displacement, belonging fully neither to their birth families nor to their married households. The psychological impact of this isolation cannot be overstated. Many queens showed signs of what we would now recognize as depression, anxiety, and other mental health conditions. They had no one to confide in, no one to seek comfort from, and no way to express their true feelings without risking political consequences. They were expected to be paragons of virtue and strength while dealing with challenges that would break most people. Some queens found solace in religious devotion, spending hours in prayer and meditation as a way to cope with their circumstances. Others threw themselves into charitable works, finding purpose in helping others, even when they couldn't help themselves. A few turned to learning and scholarship, becoming patrons of artists and writers who could express the emotions they themselves had to keep hidden. The most tragic aspect of medieval queenship was how these intelligent, capable women were forced to suppress their own personalities and desires in service of their royal roles. They could never simply be themselves. They had to be symbols, representatives, and political tools. Their worth was measured not by their character, intelligence, or accomplishments, but by their ability to produce male heirs and maintain peaceful relationships with foreign powers. Yet despite all these constraints and hardships, medieval queens developed remarkable resilience and found ways to exercise influence and create meaning in their lives. They became masters of subtle political maneuvering, using their positions to protect their children, advance causes they believed in, and sometimes even to shape the course of history. Their stories remind us that even in the most restrictive circumstances, the human spirit finds ways to endure, adapt, and sometimes even thrive. The legacy of these medieval queens extends far beyond their individual stories. They established precedents for female leadership that would influence royal traditions for centuries to come. They patronized arts and learning that enriched their cultures. They navigated impossible political situations with grace and intelligence. And they bore the weight of expectations that no human being should have to carry, doing so with a dignity that commands our respect and admiration across the centuries. Looking at the reference materials and the script summary you've provided, I'll continue with part 5 of the Medieval Queen's script, maintaining the contemplative tone and text-to-speech friendly format while exploring the political dimensions of queenship. Beyond the confines of birthing chambers and the scrutiny of reproductive expectations, medieval queens found themselves navigating an intricate web of political alliances and court intrigues that would challenge even the most seasoned diplomats. The Queen's political role was a delicate balancing act between wielding influence and maintaining the appearance of feminine submission that medieval society demanded. A queen's political education often began in childhood, though rarely through formal instruction. Instead, it came through careful observation of the women around her, watching how they maneuvered through conversations, how they planted suggestions rather than gave commands, how they built networks of loyalty through gifts, favors, and strategic kindnesses. These were the tools of queenly power, subtle instruments that allowed them to shape policy and politics while never appearing to challenge male authority directly. The medieval court was a complex ecosystem where every gesture carried meaning, every conversation held potential consequence, and every alliance could shift with the changing seasons. Queens learned to read the subtle signs of court life like scholars read ancient texts. They understood that a courtier's absence from morning prayers might signal shifting loyalties, that the placement of guests at a feast table could communicate favour or disfavour more clearly than any proclamation, that the choice of which ladies to include in private conversations could determine the success or failure of delicate negotiations. Eleanor of Aquitaine stands as perhaps the most remarkable example of a medieval queen who mastered the art of political manoeuvring. Born to wealth and power in her own right as Duchess of Aquitaine, Eleanor brought vast territories to her marriages, first to Louis VII of France and later to Henry II of England. Her story illustrates both the potential power and the constant dangers faced by politically active queens. Eleanor's early years as Queen of France revealed the challenges facing even the most privileged of medieval women. Despite bringing substantial lands to the marriage, she found herself constantly criticised for her independence, her fashion choices, and her failure to produce a male heir quickly enough. The French court viewed her Aquitanian customs with suspicion, seeing her love of poetry and music as frivolous, her colourful clothing as inappropriate, and her outspoken nature as unseemly for a queen. When Eleanor accompanied Louis on the Second Crusade, she demonstrated both the possibilities and perils of queenly involvement in military campaigns. She brought her own troops from Aquitaine and attempted to influence military strategy, but her efforts were met with resistance from male commanders who saw her participation as inappropriate interference. Rumours circulated about her conduct during the campaign, whispers that would follow her for the rest of her life, and demonstrate how a queen's reputation could become a weapon used against her political ambitions. The dissolution of Eleanor's marriage to Louis VII and her subsequent union with Henry II of England showcased another dimension of queenly political power. In an age when divorce was nearly impossible, Eleanor managed to annul her first marriage on grounds of consanguinity, reclaim her territories, and within months marry the future King of England. This remarkable sequence of events required not only legal acumen, but also careful political timing and the ability to build coalitions of support among nobles, clergy, and advisors. As Queen of England, Eleanor wielded considerable influence during the early years of Henry's reign. She established her own court, patronized troubadours and poets, and created a cultural renaissance that spread from England to France. Her court became a center for the development of courtly love literature and chivalric ideals, demonstrating how queens could shape cultural and intellectual life even when formal political power remained limited. However, Eleanor's political ambitions ultimately brought her into direct conflict with her husband. When their sons rebelled against Henry II, Eleanor supported them, recognizing that her political future lay with the next generation rather than with her increasingly estranged husband. This decision led to her imprisonment for 16 years, a stark reminder of the ultimate powerlessness of even the most influential queens when they challenged royal authority too directly. During her captivity, Eleanor's political education continued in a different form. She learned patience, the value of waiting for the right moment, and how to maintain influence even while physically confined. She corresponded with allies, received visitors who kept her informed of political developments, and carefully planned for her eventual release. When Henry II died, and her son Richard became king, Eleanor emerged from captivity as one of the most experienced and politically astute figures in medieval Europe. Eleanor's later years as Queen Mother demonstrated another avenue of queenly power. While her son Richard was away on crusade, she served as regent, governing England with skill and authority that few questioned. Her age and experience, combined with her role as the king's mother, gave her a legitimacy that she had never fully possessed as a wife. She negotiated Richard's ransom when he was captured, arranged his marriage alliance with Berengaria of Navarre, and continued to influence policy well into her 70s. The political challenges faced by medieval queens extended beyond personal relationships to encompass the broader realm of international diplomacy. Queens often served as crucial links between their birth families and their marital kingdoms, maintaining correspondence with relatives, facilitating trade agreements, and sometimes serving as informal ambassadors during tense negotiations. This role required them to balance potentially conflicting loyalties, while never appearing to prioritize their birth families over their adopted kingdoms. Marriage negotiations themselves represented one of the most significant political responsibilities of medieval queens. While kings made the final decisions about their children's marriages, queens often conducted the preliminary negotiations, corresponded with potential bride families, and evaluated the political and personal suitability of proposed matches. This work required extensive knowledge of European royal genealogies, current political alliances, and the shifting balance of power between kingdoms. Queens also played crucial roles in managing court ceremonies and protocol, responsibilities that carried significant political weight. The choice of which nobles to honor with invitations to important celebrations, how to arrange seating at state banquets, which foreign ambassadors to receive with particular ceremony, and how to balance competing claims for royal attention all fell within the Queen's purview. These decisions could strengthen or weaken alliances, send messages about royal favor or disfavor, and influence the delicate web of relationships that held medieval kingdoms together. Religious patronage represented another avenue through which medieval queens exercised political influence. By founding monasteries, endowing churches, and supporting particular religious orders, queens could build networks of spiritual allies while demonstrating their piety and worthiness. Religious institutions provided education, care for the poor, and moral authority that could be valuable allies for queens navigating political challenges. The abbesses and bishops who benefited from royal patronage often became important sources of counsel and support. However, the political involvement of medieval queens was always constrained by the fundamental expectation that they remain subordinate to male authority. Queens who appeared too ambitious, too independent, or too willing to challenge their husbands risked not only their own positions, but also accusations of unwomanly behavior that could undermine their effectiveness. They had to learn to exercise power indirectly, through suggestion rather than command, through alliance building rather than direct confrontation. The education of medieval queens in political matters was largely informal and experiential. Unlike princes who received formal instruction in statecraft, law, and military strategy, queens learned through observation, conversation, and gradual involvement in court activities. They developed skills in reading people, understanding motivations, and predicting the consequences of various political decisions. This education never ended, as the political landscape of medieval Europe was constantly shifting with new alliances, conflicts, and opportunities. The correspondence of medieval queens reveals the sophistication of their political thinking and the complexity of their roles. Letters between queens and their allies show careful attention to diplomatic language, awareness of the broader implications of local decisions, and strategic thinking about long-term political goals. These women understood that their words would be scrutinized, their motives questioned, and their decisions evaluated not only for their immediate effects, but for their implications for royal authority and dynastic stability. As we consider the political dimensions of medieval queenship, we see women who were far more than decorative figures or passive vessels for royal offspring. They were active participants in the governance of their realms, skilled diplomats who managed complex relationships, and strategic thinkers who understood the intricate connections between personal relationships and political power. Their influence was often subtle and indirect, but it was nonetheless real and significant in shaping the course of medieval history. The political legacy of medieval queens extends beyond their individual achievements to encompass their role in developing new models of female authority and influence. Through their careful navigation of the constraints placed upon them, they created space for future generations of royal women to exercise power and influence. Their stories remind us that even within the most restrictive social systems, determined individuals could find ways to shape their world and leave lasting impacts on the course of human events. The political education and involvement of medieval queens also highlights the importance of informal power structures in medieval society. While formal authority rested with kings and male nobles, the actual functioning of medieval kingdoms depended heavily on the networks of relationship, obligation, and influence that queens helped to create and maintain. Their political work, though often invisible in official records, was essential to the stability and success of medieval monarchies. As we continue to explore the complex world of medieval queenship, we gain a deeper appreciation for the intelligence, resilience, and political acumen of these remarkable women. Their stories challenge simple narratives about medieval gender roles and remind us that the exercise of power and influence has always been more complex and nuanced than formal structures might suggest. In their careful balance of constraint and agency, medieval queens created a unique form of political authority that would influence royal women for centuries to come. Here's part 6 of the Medieval Queen's script, continuing from where you left off. Yet even the most resourceful and determined medieval queens faced challenges that went far beyond the political arena. The very act of maintaining their health and physical well-being was fraught with difficulties that would be almost unimaginable to us today. Medical knowledge was primitive at best, often dangerously misguided at worst, and queens, despite their elevated status, were just as vulnerable to illness and injury as any other woman of their time. Consider the medical treatments available to a medieval queen suffering from what we would now recognize as a simple infection. Rather than antibiotics or sterile procedures, she would likely be subjected to bloodletting, a practice based on the flawed theory that illness resulted from an imbalance of bodily humors. Physicians would make deliberate cuts in her arms or apply leeches to drain what they believed was corrupted blood, often weakening her further and introducing new sources of infection. the very treatments designed to heal could prove more dangerous than the original ailment. The medieval understanding of anatomy was equally problematic. Dissection of human bodies was largely forbidden by the Church, leaving physicians to base their knowledge on ancient texts and animal studies. When Queen Isabella of France suffered complications during the birth of her son, the future Edward III, her physicians had no real understanding of obstetrics or surgical intervention. They could only rely on herbal remedies, prayer, and hope, while Isabella endured hours of agony that modern medicine could have alleviated in minutes. The preparation and consumption of food presented another daily hazard for medieval queens. Despite having access to the finest ingredients and most skilled cooks, food safety was a constant concern. Without refrigeration or understanding of bacterial contamination, even the most carefully prepared meals could harbour deadly pathogens. Meat was often preserved with salt or spices that might mask the taste of spoilage, and dairy products could turn dangerous within hours in warm weather. Queen Berengaria of Navarre, wife of Richard the Lionheart, fell seriously ill during the Third Crusade after consuming what was likely contaminated water or food. Her physicians, lacking any understanding of microbiology, attributed her illness to an excess of yellow bile and prescribed a diet of cold, moist foods to restore balance. Such treatments were not only ineffective, but often prolonged suffering and delayed any natural recovery the body might have achieved on its own. The very environment in which medieval queens lived, despite its luxury, harboured numerous health hazards. Castle walls, while providing security, also trapped moisture and created conditions perfect for mould and mildew. Tapestries and wall hangings, while beautiful, collected dust and provided hiding places for insects and rodents. Even the finest chambers were heated by open fires that filled rooms with smoke, leading to respiratory problems that plagued many nobles throughout their lives. Personal hygiene, though better maintained among the nobility than among common people, was still rudimentary by modern standards. Queens might bathe more frequently than their subjects, perhaps once a week, or even more often, but soap was a luxury item and hot water had to be laboriously heated and carried to wooden tubs. The lack of understanding about the connection between cleanliness and health meant that even well-intentioned hygiene practices could be inadequate or counterproductive. The cosmetics and beauty treatments available to medieval queens often contained substances we now know to be toxic. Lead-based face paints were common, prized for their ability to create the pale complexion that was considered fashionable. These cosmetics, applied regularly over years, could cause lead poisoning, resulting in neurological damage, reproductive problems, and even death. Queen Elizabeth I of England, though from a later period, exemplified the dangers of such beauty practices, her face reportedly scarred and damaged by decades of applying lead-based makeup. Dental care was another area where medieval queens suffered despite their privileged status. Sugar, when available, was a luxury that the wealthy could afford, leading to tooth decay and gum disease among the nobility. Dental hygiene consisted mainly of rinsing with wine or herbal solutions, and tooth extraction was the primary treatment for serious dental problems. Many queens endured chronic pain from dental issues, which could affect their ability to eat properly and maintain their health. The psychological toll of these physical challenges cannot be underestimated. A queen suffering from chronic pain, whether from dental problems, complications from childbirth, or other ailments, would still be expected to fulfill her ceremonial and political duties. She could not simply retreat to bed when unwell, as her presence was required at court functions, religious ceremonies, and state occasions. The pressure to maintain a composed and regal appearance while dealing with pain or illness required extraordinary mental fortitude. Sleep, that most basic of human needs, was often disrupted for medieval queens by both environmental factors and the demands of their position. Castle chambers, despite being the finest available, were drafty and cold. heated only by fireplaces that required constant tending. The sounds of the castle never truly ceased, with guards making their rounds, servants going about their duties, and the general bustle of a large household. Queens often had to share their sleeping quarters with attendants, further reducing privacy and peaceful rest. The clothing that symbolized a queen's status and power also presented daily challenges to her physical comfort and health. The elaborate gowns, while magnificent, were incredibly heavy and restrictive. Multiple layers of fabric, jeweled ornaments, and structured undergarments could weigh dozens of pounds, making simple movement exhausting. The tight lacing required to achieve the fashionable silhouette could restrict breathing and circulation, leading to fainting spells that were so common they were simply accepted as normal. These physical constraints extended beyond mere discomfort to impact a queen's ability to respond to emergencies or even to move freely within her own domain. If a crisis arose requiring quick action or movement, a queen's elaborate costume could prove a serious hindrance. The process of dressing and undressing was so complex that it required multiple attendants and significant time, meaning that a queen could not quickly adapt her appearance to changing circumstances. The seasonal variations in medieval life presented additional challenges to royal health and comfort. Winter brought not just cold, but also the increased risk of illness as people crowded together indoors. The limited diet available during winter months, even for royalty, could lead to nutritional deficiencies. Vitamin deficiencies were common, resulting in conditions like scurvy, which could cause bleeding gums, tooth loss, and weakness. Even queens with access to preserved fruits and vegetables were not immune to these seasonal health challenges. The medieval understanding of mental health was virtually non-existent, yet queens faced enormous psychological pressures that would challenge anyone's mental well-being. The constant scrutiny, the weight of responsibility, the isolation from family, and the ever-present threat of political upheaval created conditions ripe for what we would now recognize as anxiety and depression. Yet these were not acknowledged as legitimate medical concerns, and queens suffering from mental distress had little recourse beyond prayer and the hope that their condition would improve on its own. Physical exercise, now recognized as crucial for both physical and mental health, was limited for medieval queens by both social expectations and practical constraints. While noble women might participate in some outdoor activities like hunting or hawking, vigorous exercise was generally considered inappropriate for ladies of high rank. The sedentary lifestyle expected of queens, combined with rich foods and limited physical activity, could lead to obesity and related health problems that further complicated their lives. Travel, an unavoidable aspect of royal life, presented its own set of health challenges. Medieval roads were rough and dangerous, and even the finest carriages provided little protection from the jolting motion that could last for days or weeks. Queens traveling while pregnant faced particular risks, as the constant movement and stress of travel could trigger complications or premature labor. Yet political necessities often required queens to travel regardless of their physical condition, placing duty above personal health and safety. The accumulation of these daily health challenges created a cycle where physical problems exacerbated political and social difficulties, which in turn created more stress and health issues. A queen suffering from chronic pain or illness might find it harder to maintain the political alliances crucial to her survival. Her reduced energy and capacity might limit her ability to participate in the complex court politics that determined her fate and that of her children. In this way, the personal became intensely political, and private suffering could have very public consequences. Despite these overwhelming challenges, many medieval queens demonstrated remarkable resilience and adaptability. They developed strategies for managing their health within the constraints of their time, often becoming knowledgeable about herbal remedies and medical treatments. Some queens established reputations as healers themselves, using their knowledge to help others while managing their own health challenges. This expertise became another form of soft power, as people sought their help and advice, creating networks of loyalty and obligation that could prove politically valuable. The story of medieval queens' health challenges reminds us that privilege and power, while providing certain advantages, could not shield them from the fundamental vulnerabilities of human existence in an age of limited medical knowledge and harsh living conditions. Their struggles with illness, pain, and the basic challenges of maintaining health in a difficult environment add another layer to our understanding of what it truly meant to be a medieval queen. Far from the romanticized image of effortless grace and beauty, the reality was one of constant vigilance against threats to health and well-being, requiring strength and determination that went far beyond what was visible to contemporary observers or modern imagination. Boring history: what life was really like for medieval queens. Part 7. Yet even when queens managed to navigate the treacherous political waters and survive the perils of childbirth, their challenges were far from over. The medieval court was a pressure cooker of competing factions, ambitious nobles, and shifting alliances where a queen's position could become precarious overnight. Consider the fate of Eleanor of Aquitaine, who went from being Queen of France to Queen of England, only to spend 16 years imprisoned by her own husband, Henry II, for supporting their son's rebellion against him. Her story illustrates how even the most powerful queens could find themselves stripped of agency and confined like common criminals. The court itself was a theatre where queens performed their roles under constant scrutiny. Every gesture, every word, every choice of clothing was analysed for political meaning. A queen who smiled too warmly at a foreign ambassador might be accused of treasonous sympathies. One who showed favour to particular nobles could upset delicate factional balances. The pressure to maintain perfect composure while navigating these deadly political currents was immense. Many queens developed what we might recognise today as anxiety disorders, constantly second-guessing their actions and living in fear of making a fatal misstep. Medieval queens also faced the unique burden of representing their birth families while serving their new kingdoms. This dual loyalty created impossible situations where they were expected to be simultaneously patriotic daughters and devoted wives, even when their homelands went to war with their adopted countries. Isabella of France, known as the She-Wolf, exemplified this impossible position when she ultimately chose to depose her own husband, Edward II of England, partly to protect French interests. Her actions saved England from civil war, but earned her a reputation for treachery that persisted for centuries. The religious expectations placed on medieval queens were equally demanding. They were expected to be paragons of Christian virtue while wielding political power in ways that often contradicted Christian teachings about feminine submission. Queens had to balance their roles as pious examples to their subjects with the harsh realities of medieval politics, which sometimes required them to order executions, wage wars, or make strategic alliances with enemies of the faith. This contradiction created deep psychological stress for many queens, who struggled to reconcile their actions with their spiritual beliefs. Financial control was another area where queens faced significant restrictions despite their apparent wealth and luxury. While queens might have access to magnificent jewels, elaborate gowns, and sumptuous feasts, they rarely controlled the purse strings directly. Their spending was monitored and controlled by male advisors, and their ability to use financial resources for political purposes was severely limited. Even wealthy queens in their own right often found their inheritances managed by others, reducing them to supplicants for funds to support their own households and charitable endeavours. The education of medieval queens, while sometimes superior to that of other women, was still carefully circumscribed to avoid threatening male authority. Queens learned languages, music, and literature, but they were rarely taught military strategy, legal theory, or administrative skills that would help them rule effectively. When circumstances forced them into positions of real power, many queens had to learn statecraft through trial and error, often making costly mistakes that were then used to justify excluding women from political authority. The few queens who did receive comprehensive educations, like Blanche of Castile or Eleanor of Aquitaine, demonstrated remarkable political acumen that challenges medieval assumptions about feminine intellectual capacity. The isolation experienced by medieval queens extended beyond the political realm into their personal relationships. Friendships were complicated by court politics, as any close relationship could be seen as creating dangerous factions or inappropriate influences. Queens often found themselves surrounded by people who wanted something from them rather than genuine companions. Even relationships with their children were complicated by dynastic considerations, as royal children were viewed as political assets to be managed rather than simply loved. Many queens expressed profound loneliness in their letters and chronicles, describing the burden of always having to be on and never being able to trust completely in anyone's motives. The medical treatment available to medieval queens, while better than what common women received, was still primitive and often dangerous by modern standards. Royal physicians relied on bloodletting, purging, and various herbal remedies that were sometimes more harmful than helpful. Queens suffering from what we would now recognize as depression, anxiety, or other mental health issues were often treated with religious remedies or blamed for moral failings. The constant stress of their positions, combined with inadequate medical care, led many queens to suffer from chronic illnesses that were poorly understood and inadequately treated. Medieval queens also faced unique challenges related to their public image and reputation. Unlike kings, whose reputations were primarily built on military and political achievements, queens were judged largely on their moral character and their success in producing male heirs. A queen who failed to conceive or who bore only daughters might find her entire reign judged a failure, regardless of her other accomplishments. Conversely, queens who were too successful in areas traditionally reserved for men might be criticized as unnatural or threatening to the proper order of society. The ceremonial aspects of queenship, while providing some of the glamour we associate with medieval royalty, were often more burden than privilege. Queens were expected to participate in elaborate court rituals, religious ceremonies, and public appearances that could last for hours or even days. These events required extensive preparation, careful choreography, and perfect execution, as any mistake could be interpreted as a bad omen or sign of divine displeasure. The physical demands of these ceremonies, combined with the psychological pressure to perform flawlessly, created additional stress for queens who were already dealing with the complexities of political life. Perhaps most tragically, medieval queens often found themselves powerless to protect those they loved most. When political considerations required the sacrifice of friends, allies, or even family members, queens were expected to acquiesce gracefully or risk their own positions. Many queens watched helplessly as their children were married off for political advantage. Their friends were exiled or executed for treason, or their homeland was invaded by their new country. The emotional toll of these forced betrayals was immense, contributing to the high rates of depression and early death among medieval queens. The legacy of medieval queens was often shaped more by political propaganda than by their actual achievements. Queens who challenged male authority or who ruled successfully in their own right were often vilified in later accounts, their accomplishments minimized or attributed to male advisors. Even queens who were celebrated in their lifetimes might find their reputations destroyed by subsequent chroniclers who disapproved of powerful women. This systematic erasure of female achievement meant that many medieval queens, who displayed remarkable intelligence, courage, and political skill, have been forgotten or misremembered by history. The daily reality of medieval queenship was thus far removed from the fairy tale images that persist in popular culture. These women lived lives of extraordinary complexity, balancing impossible expectations while navigating deadly political currents with limited agency and support. They faced unique challenges that combined the general hardships of medieval life with the specific burdens of feminine royalty, creating experiences that were simultaneously privileged and profoundly constrained. Their stories reveal not just the limitations placed on women in medieval society, but also the remarkable resilience and intelligence of those who managed to thrive despite these obstacles. Understanding the true experiences of medieval queens helps us appreciate both how far women's rights have advanced and how many of the challenges they faced continue to resonate today. Their struggles with balancing public and private roles, managing competing loyalties, and maintaining authority in male-dominated environments remain relevant for women in leadership positions across the centuries. By examining their lives honestly, we gain insight not just into medieval history, but into the ongoing human story of women's quest for agency, respect, and the right to shape their own destinies. Looking at the context from your previous script parts and the reference materials, here's part 8 of your script. The medieval Queen's Chamber was a stage where every gesture was scrutinized, every word weighed for political meaning, and every expression interpreted as a sign of divine favor or displeasure. Privacy, as we understand it today, simply did not exist for these women who occupied the highest echelons of medieval society. Imagine waking each morning to find a dozen pairs of eyes already watching you. Ladies in waiting, chamberers, and various court officials would be present from the moment a queen stirred in her bed until she retired at night. Even the most intimate moments of her daily routine became public spectacles, choreographed performances that reinforced her status while simultaneously constraining her humanity. The morning routine of a medieval queen was an elaborate ritual that could take several hours to complete. She would be dressed by her ladies-in-waiting in layers upon layers of clothing, each garment carefully selected to convey messages about her wealth, piety, and political allegiances. The choice of colors, fabrics, and jewels was never arbitrary, but rather a complex form of communication that spoke to those who understood the subtle language of medieval court fashion. Her breakfast, like everything else, was a public affair. The queen would dine while courtiers watched, their presence serving both ceremonial and practical purposes. Food tasters ensured her safety from poison, while the elaborate presentation of dishes reinforced the majesty of her position. Yet this constant observation meant that even a simple meal became a performance, with the queen unable to display genuine emotion or preference without it being noted and potentially used against her. The weight of representation extended far beyond personal comfort. Every decision a medieval queen made carried the potential for far-reaching political consequences. Her choice of which nobles to favor with her attention, which religious observances to emphasize, and even which books to read or music to enjoy could shift the delicate balance of court politics. She was simultaneously the most powerful woman in the realm and utterly constrained by the expectations of that power. Consider the challenge of maintaining diplomatic relationships through personal correspondence. A medieval queen's letters were never truly private documents, but rather state communications that would be scrutinized by advisors, copied by scribes, and potentially intercepted by enemies. Every word had to be carefully chosen to avoid giving offense, while advancing her kingdom's interests. The art of saying much, while revealing little, became an essential skill for survival. The pressure to maintain an image of serene composure was relentless. Medieval queens were expected to embody the ideal of Christian virtue, displaying patience, humility, and grace, even in the face of personal tragedy or political crisis. They could not afford to show weakness, anger, or despair, regardless of what turmoil might be raging within their hearts. This emotional suppression took a tremendous toll on their mental and physical health, yet it was seen as an essential aspect of their royal duty. The paradox of medieval queenship becomes even more apparent when examining their role in religious life. While they were expected to be paragons of Christian virtue and often served as patrons of religious institutions, their very existence as wielders of temporal power created theological tensions. Medieval church doctrine was ambivalent about female authority, and queens had to navigate carefully between demonstrating appropriate piety and maintaining the political influence necessary to rule effectively. Many medieval queens found creative ways to exercise power within these constraints, developing what historians call soft power strategies. They would influence policy through their roles as wives and mothers, using their positions to advance certain courtiers or religious reforms, while maintaining the appearance of feminine submission. This required extraordinary political acumen and emotional intelligence, as they had to achieve their goals without appearing to actively seek them. The queens who succeeded in leaving lasting legacies were often those who mastered the art of working within the system while gradually expanding its boundaries. They understood that direct confrontation with male authority structures would likely fail, so they employed more subtle methods of influence. Through patronage of the arts and scholarship, establishment of religious foundations, and careful cultivation of networks of loyal supporters, they could effect change while maintaining their positions. Yet even these successful queens paid a personal price for their achievements. The constant need to balance competing demands, to present a perfect public face while managing complex political realities, and to suppress their own desires in service of their roles, created a profound isolation. They lived surrounded by people, yet were often fundamentally alone, unable to form genuine friendships or express authentic emotions without risk. The physical toll of medieval queenship was equally severe. The elaborate clothing required for court appearances was often heavy and restrictive, making simple movement difficult. The cosmetics and beauty treatments of the era frequently contained toxic substances like lead and mercury, which could cause serious health problems over time. The stress of constant performance and political maneuvering manifested in various ailments that medieval medicine was ill-equipped to treat. Perhaps most tragically, the very qualities that made medieval queens effective rulers, their intelligence, ambition, and political skill, were often seen as threats to the male-dominated power structure. They had to be clever enough to navigate complex political situations, yet not so obviously intelligent as to challenge masculine authority. They needed to be strong enough to endure tremendous pressures, yet appear fragile enough to maintain feminine ideals. This impossible balancing act required them to fragment their personalities, showing different aspects of themselves to different audiences, while never revealing their complete authentic selves to anyone. The loneliness of medieval queenship extended beyond the personal to encompass a kind of historical isolation as well. Their stories were typically recorded by male chroniclers, who often emphasized their roles as wives and mothers while downplaying their political achievements. This means that much of what we know about medieval queens comes filtered through the perspectives of men who may not have fully understood or appreciated the complexity of their positions. The legacy of these remarkable women lies not just in the specific policies they influenced or the institutions they founded, but in their demonstration of how human beings can adapt and thrive even under the most constraining circumstances. They showed that power could be exercised through patience and subtlety, as well as through force, and that influence could be maintained through networks of relationship and obligation, rather than through direct command. Their example reminds us that leadership takes many forms, and that some of the most effective rulers in history have been those who understood how to work within existing systems while gradually transforming them. The medieval queens, who left the most lasting impact, were often those who recognized that sustainable change comes through building consensus and creating new possibilities, rather than through direct confrontation with established power structures. In examining their lives, we see both the constraints that limited human potential in the medieval world and the remarkable creativity that individuals could display in transcending those limitations. These women lived lives of extraordinary complexity, managing to exercise real influence and leave lasting legacies while operating within a system that was designed to limit their agency at every turn. Boring history. What life was really like for medieval queens, Part 9. But perhaps nothing illustrated the paradox of medieval queenship more starkly than the institution of queenly motherhood itself. While modern sensibilities might assume that bearing children brought medieval queens closer to fulfillment and security, the reality was far more complex and perilous. Pregnancy and childbirth were quite literally matters of life and death, not just for the child, but for the queen herself. Consider the haunting case of Jane Seymour, Henry VIII's third wife, who died just 12 days after giving birth to the future Edward VI. Or Isabella of Valois, who died in childbirth at age 19 while married to Richard II. These were not isolated tragedies but common occurrences that cast a shadow over every royal pregnancy. Medieval obstetrics were primitive at best, relying on superstition and tradition rather than medical knowledge. Queens laboured in darkened chambers, attended by midwives whose training consisted largely of folklore and prayer. The very clothing that marked a queen's status could become a death trap during labour. The elaborate gowns, tight bodices, and restrictive undergarments that were symbols of royal dignity had to be carefully removed, leaving queens vulnerable and exposed at their most critical moments. The irony was bitter. The very garments that proclaimed their elevated status could literally strangle them when they needed freedom of movement most. But even when queens survived childbirth, their trials were far from over. Medieval medicine had little understanding of postpartum care. Infections were common and often fatal. Queens were expected to remain confined for weeks after delivery, lying in stuffy, unventilated chambers that were breeding grounds for disease. The practice of lying in was supposed to protect new mothers, but it often sealed their fate instead. The psychological toll was equally devastating. Queens who failed to produce male heirs faced not just disappointment, but genuine terror. They knew their marriages, their security, even their lives could depend on delivering sons. Anne Boleyn's desperation to produce a male heir after giving birth to Elizabeth was palpable in her letters, writing frantically to Henry about her hopes for future sons, even as the king's affections were already wandering toward Jane Seymour. Medieval queens also faced the heartbreak of infant mortality at rates that would be unthinkable today. Roughly half of all children born to medieval royal families died before reaching adulthood. Queens watched helplessly as their babies succumbed to diseases that are easily treatable today. Measles, whooping cough, simple infections. The emotional devastation of losing child after child while under constant pressure to produce heirs created a cycle of grief that many queens never escaped. Eleanor of Aquitaine bore 10 children, but watched several die in infancy and childhood. Her surviving children often lived tumultuous lives. Her sons rebelled against their father, Henry II. Her daughters were married off to secure political alliances that frequently ended in misery. The Queen, who had once been the most powerful woman in Europe, spent her later years grieving not just for the children she had lost, but for the ones whose lives had been consumed by the very political machinery she had helped to create. The spacing of royal pregnancies reveals another dimension of queenly suffering. Medieval queens were expected to become pregnant as quickly as possible after each birth, giving their bodies little time to recover. This relentless cycle of pregnancy, childbirth, and recovery took an enormous physical toll. Many queens aged rapidly, their health broken by constant childbearing. Isabella of Castile, despite being one of the most successful rulers of her era, bore 5 children in rapid succession and struggled with health problems that historians now believe were related to the physical demands of constant pregnancy. Even the wet nurse system, which might seem like a luxury, carried its own emotional costs. Royal babies were immediately handed over to carefully selected nurses, meaning queens often had limited physical contact with their own children during the crucial early months. This practice was intended to allow queens to become pregnant again more quickly, but it also meant that many royal mothers formed only distant relationships with their offspring. The children who survived were often raised more by servants than by their actual parents, creating family dynamics that were formal and emotionally distant. The education of royal children presented yet another challenge for medieval queens. While queens were expected to oversee their children's upbringing, they often had little say in the actual content of that education. Sons were trained for warfare and statecraft from an early age, while daughters were prepared primarily for marriage and motherhood. Queens who had experienced the limitations of their own education keenly felt the frustration of watching their daughters receive the same inadequate preparation for life. Some queens did manage to influence their children's education despite these constraints. Blanche of Castile, who served as regent of France, ensured that her son Louis IX received not just military training but also education in justice, mercy, and good governance. Her influence helped shape him into one of medieval France's most revered kings. But such success stories were rare exceptions to the general rule that queens had limited control over their children's development. The religious education of royal children was another area where queens could exercise some influence, though even here they faced restrictions. Queens were expected to ensure their children were devout Catholics, but they could not deviate from orthodox teachings, even if their personal beliefs or experiences suggested alternative approaches. The religious instruction available to medieval royal children was often rigid and fear-based, emphasizing sin and punishment rather than love and forgiveness. Marriage negotiations for royal children began when they were still infants, with queens often forced to watch helplessly as their babies were promised to foreign princes or princesses for political advantage. These early betrothals meant that queens knew from birth that their children would likely be separated from them permanently upon reaching adolescence. The emotional impact of raising children who were destined to leave for foreign courts created a unique form of maternal grief that was considered simply part of royal life. Medieval queens also had to navigate the complex politics surrounding their children's inheritance rights. In many kingdoms, the succession was not automatic, and queens had to work constantly to ensure their children's claims were recognized and protected. This often meant forming alliances with powerful nobles, making political concessions, or even arranging marriages for their children that served strategic rather than personal interests. The case of Margaret Beaufort illustrates the extremes to which royal mothers would go to secure their children's futures. After her son Henry Tudor was forced into exile following the Wars of the Roses, Margaret spent years secretly building support for his eventual return to claim the English throne. She used her marriages, her wealth, and her political connections to create a network of supporters who would eventually help Henry become Henry VII. Her dedication to her son's cause was so complete that she risked her own life multiple times, corresponding secretly with his supporters, and even helping to finance his invasion of England. But Margaret's success came at enormous personal cost. She saw her son only sporadically during his years in exile and lived in constant fear that their correspondence would be discovered and she would be executed for treason. When Henry finally became king, their relationship was necessarily formal and political rather than warm and maternal. The price of securing the throne for her son was the sacrifice of any normal mother-child relationship. The religious obligations surrounding royal motherhood added another layer of complexity to queens' lives. Medieval Christianity taught that childbirth was both a blessing and a punishment. A blessing because children were gifts from God, but also a punishment because the pain of labor was considered part of Eve's curse for original sin. Queens were expected to accept both the joy and the suffering of motherhood as divinely ordained, making it difficult for them to express frustration or seek help for the very real challenges they faced. The churching ceremony that followed successful childbirths reveals the ambivalent medieval attitude toward female reproduction. After giving birth, queens were considered ritually unclean and had to undergo a purification ceremony before they could return to normal court life. This practice reinforced the idea that female biological functions were somehow contaminating, even when they served the essential political function of producing heirs. Medieval queens who lost children in infancy or who failed to conceive at all faced not just personal grief, but also public judgment. They were often blamed for these failures, with court physicians and religious advisors suggesting that their behavior, diet, or moral character was responsible for their reproductive difficulties. This victim-blaming added psychological torment to what was already devastating personal loss. The few queens who managed to maintain close relationships with their children often did so by defying social expectations in subtle ways. Eleanor of Provence, wife of Henry III of England, was criticised by contemporary chroniclers for being too involved in her children's lives and too protective of their interests. But her excessive maternal devotion may have been simply normal parental love, expressed in a context that expected royal mothers to be emotionally distant. Some medieval queens found ways to channel their maternal instincts into broader social causes when their own reproductive experiences were limited or tragic. Queens who had lost children sometimes became patrons of orphanages or hospitals for children. Those who struggled with infertility might dedicate themselves to supporting other women through difficult pregnancies and births. These activities allowed them to express maternal feelings while also serving legitimate royal functions of charity and social welfare. The seasonal nature of medieval royal pregnancies reveals another aspect of the calculated approach to royal reproduction. Queens often timed their pregnancies to avoid giving birth during certain seasons or political events. Winter births were considered more dangerous due to cold and poor nutrition, while births during military campaigns could create political vulnerabilities. This level of planning around pregnancy shows how even the most intimate aspects of royal life were subject to political calculation. Medieval medical texts written for royal households reveal the extent to which queens' reproductive health was monitored and controlled. Detailed instructions exist for royal physicians on everything from managing morning sickness to determining the sex of unborn children, through examination of the mother's appearance and behavior. These texts show that royal pregnancies were treated as matters of state importance, with teams of experts dedicated to ensuring successful outcomes. The international dimension of royal marriage meant that pregnant queens often found themselves far from their birth families during their most vulnerable times. A French princess married to an English king would face childbirth surrounded by foreign attendants, unable to communicate easily with her midwives, separated from the women who had raised her and might have provided emotional support. This isolation compounded the already considerable physical and emotional challenges of medieval childbirth. The preservation of royal bloodlines through careful breeding practices sometimes led to marriages between cousins or other relatives, creating additional health risks for royal children. Medieval queens often had to watch their children suffer from genetic conditions that resulted from these politically motivated marriages between related royal families. The irony was stark. The very practices intended to preserve royal bloodlines often weakened them instead. As we consider the full scope of medieval queenly motherhood, we see yet another area where the theoretical power and privilege of royal status was undermined by the harsh realities of medieval life. Queens were expected to be both political assets and devoted mothers, to risk their lives repeatedly in childbirth while maintaining their composure and dignity, to love their children deeply while accepting that political necessity might require sending them away or sacrificing their happiness for dynastic advantage. The courage required to face these challenges repeatedly, knowing that each pregnancy might be fatal and each child might be lost to disease or political upheaval, speaks to a form of bravery that is rarely acknowledged in traditional accounts of medieval history. These queens faced dangers in their private chambers that were every bit as threatening as any battlefield their husbands might encounter, yet they received little recognition for their valor. Their experiences remind us that behind the glittering ceremonies and elaborate court rituals lay human beings grappling with the most fundamental challenges of existence: love, loss, hope, and fear. The medieval queens who navigated these treacherous waters while maintaining their public roles and advancing their political agendas demonstrated a form of multitasking and emotional resilience that challenges any simplistic notions about the capabilities and contributions of women in the medieval world. Understanding the reality of medieval queenly motherhood helps us appreciate not just the personal costs of royal life, but also the ways in which political systems built on hereditary monarchy placed impossible burdens on the women expected to perpetuate them. These queens were not just decorative figures or passive victims, but active participants in a complex and often brutal political system that demanded everything from them, while offering uncertain rewards in return. The reality of medieval queenship extended far beyond the grand ceremonies and public appearances that consumed so much of their daily lives. Behind the elaborate rituals and carefully orchestrated displays of power lay a world of profound personal isolation and psychological burden that few could truly comprehend. For a medieval queen, the concept of privacy was virtually non-existent. Her every action scrutinized not just by the court, but by an entire kingdom watching for signs of weakness, favor, or divine displeasure. Consider the daily reality of Eleanor of Aquitaine during her years as Queen of France and later England. Every morning began not with personal choice, but with the careful orchestration of her appearance by a team of attendants who would dress her in garments that conveyed specific political messages. The colors she wore, the jewels she displayed, even the way her hair was arranged, all carried diplomatic significance that could affect international relations. A wrong choice of adornment could inadvertently signal alliance with one faction over another, potentially sparking conflicts that might rage for years. The psychological toll of this constant performance cannot be overstated. Medieval queens lived in a perpetual state of theatrical existence, where authentic emotion was a luxury they could rarely afford. When Blanche of Castile received news of military defeats during her regency for young Louis IX, she could not display the fear and desperation she undoubtedly felt. Instead, she had to project unwavering confidence to maintain the stability of the realm, bottling up her terror while making life and death decisions that would affect thousands of lives. The burden of perpetual pregnancy added another layer of psychological strain to royal life. Queens understood that their primary value lay in their reproductive capacity, and the pressure to produce male heirs created a constant state of anxiety. Berengaria of Navarre, wife of Richard the Lionheart, endured years of whispered speculation about her childlessness, with court physicians subjecting her to increasingly desperate and often painful treatments designed to encourage conception. The monthly cycle became a public matter of state, with the Queen's fertility monitored and discussed by councils of male advisors who felt entitled to intimate knowledge of her bodily functions. When pregnancies did occur, they brought their own psychological torments. Medieval queens were acutely aware of the horrifying statistics surrounding childbirth mortality. They had witnessed too many friends and relatives die in agony during labor to approach their own pregnancies with anything but dread. Isabella of Valois, child bride of Richard II of England, was barely 14 when she became pregnant for the first time. Historical accounts describe her terror as her delivery approached, having heard detailed accounts of the excruciating deaths of other young queens who had attempted to bear children before their bodies were ready. The loss of children which happened with devastating frequency, created profound psychological wounds that queens were expected to bear with stoic grace. When Margaret of Anjou lost her young son Edward at the Battle of Tewkesbury, ending the Lancastrian hopes for the throne, she faced not only personal grief, but the collapse of everything she had worked to achieve. Yet public expectations demanded that she maintain her dignity and composure even as her world crumbled around her. The medieval concept of royal dignity left no room for the natural expressions of grief that might have provided some psychological relief. Medieval queens also bore the unique psychological burden of divided loyalties that could tear apart their sense of identity. When they married, they were expected to transfer their allegiance completely to their new kingdoms, sometimes even taking up arms against their birth families. Eleanor of Aquitaine faced this impossible situation repeatedly, watching her sons rebel against their father Henry II while being expected to remain neutral despite her maternal instincts. The emotional cost of these divided loyalties created internal conflicts that had no satisfactory resolution. The isolation of royal life compounded these psychological pressures. While queens were constantly surrounded by people, they were also profoundly alone. Every relationship was coloured by political calculation, every friendship potentially compromised by court intrigue. Queens could never be certain whether the people around them offered genuine affection or merely sought to advance their own positions. This created a paranoid atmosphere where trust became a dangerous luxury. Anne Boleyn's final letters reveal a woman who had become increasingly isolated as former allies abandoned her when her political fortunes declined. Religious pressure added yet another dimension to the psychological burden of queenship. Medieval queens were expected to serve as moral exemplars for their kingdoms while navigating the often corrupt and politically motivated demands of church hierarchy. They had to balance personal faith with political necessity, sometimes finding themselves forced to support religious policies that contradicted their personal beliefs. When Catherine of Aragon refused to accept the annulment of her marriage to Henry VIII, she faced not only political consequences, but profound spiritual anguish as she struggled to reconcile her duty to God with her duty to preserve the legitimacy of her daughter Mary. The constant threat of political violence created a state of chronic stress that affected every aspect of royal life. Medieval queens lived with the knowledge that their positions made them targets for assassination, kidnapping, or worse. They had seen too many examples of royal women who had fallen from grace to feel secure in their positions. The psychological impact of this perpetual danger manifested in various ways, from the development of elaborate security protocols to the careful cultivation of multiple escape plans. Queens also faced the unique challenge of aging in the public eye while maintaining their political relevance. As their beauty faded and their childbearing years ended, they had to find new ways to maintain their influence and protect their positions. The transition from fertile young queen to dowager required a complete reinvention of identity that few were prepared to navigate successfully. Many queens found themselves increasingly marginalized as they aged, their counsel dismissed and their presence barely tolerated by younger courtiers seeking favor with the next generation. The financial pressures facing medieval queens created additional psychological stress. While they lived in apparent luxury, queens often struggled with significant debt and financial constraints that limited their ability to fulfill their expected roles. They were expected to maintain lavish households, provide generous patronage to artists and religious institutions, and fund various charitable endeavors, all while working within budgets that were frequently inadequate to meet these demands. The constant worry about money, combined with the impossibility of discussing these concerns publicly, created a burden that weighed heavily on many royal women. Perhaps most psychologically damaging was the complete lack of agency that characterized so much of medieval queenship. From childhood, royal women were trained to subordinate their personal desires to political necessity. They could not choose their husbands, determine the size of their families, select their closest advisors, or even decide how to spend their days. This systematic denial of personal autonomy created psychological wounds that affected every aspect of their lives, leading to depression, anxiety, and various forms of psychological dysfunction that medieval medicine was powerless to address. The coping mechanisms available to medieval queens were limited and often inadequate. Some found solace in religious devotion, throwing themselves into prayer and charitable works with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Others turned to scholarship and patronage of the arts, seeking intellectual stimulation as an escape from their constrained circumstances. A few, like Eleanor of Aquitaine, channeled their frustrations into political maneuvering and rebellion, though such actions carried enormous risks. Many queens developed elaborate private rituals and secret spaces where they could experience brief moments of authentic selfhood, away from the constant demands of their public roles. These might include private gardens where they could walk alone, secret correspondence with trusted confidants, or small acts of defiance that provided psychological relief without threatening their positions. The preservation of some inner core of authentic self became a survival strategy that allowed them to endure decades of psychological pressure. The support systems available to medieval queens were often compromised by the very political structures they were meant to navigate. While they might have extensive households filled with servants and attendants, these relationships were fundamentally unequal and could not provide the genuine emotional support that might have helped them cope with their burdens. The few relationships that offered authentic connection, such as those with particularly trusted ladies-in-waiting or spiritual advisors, became precious lifelines that queens protected fiercely. Despite these overwhelming psychological challenges, many medieval queens demonstrated remarkable resilience and adaptability. They developed sophisticated strategies for maintaining their sanity and protecting their essential selves while fulfilling their demanding public roles. Their survival and occasional triumph in the face of such systematic psychological pressure stands as a testament to the extraordinary strength of the human spirit when faced with seemingly impossible circumstances. The psychological legacy of medieval queenship extended far beyond the individual women who held these positions. Their experiences shaped cultural expectations about female leadership, sacrifice, and duty that influenced European society for centuries. The image of the suffering but dignified queen became a powerful archetype that continued to influence how royal women were expected to behave long after the medieval period had ended. Their stories remind us that behind every crown lay a human being struggling to maintain her identity and sanity in a world designed to strip away both personal agency and authentic selfhood. Based on the reference videos and the script summary you've provided, here's part 11 of the 12-part script about medieval queens. The physical demands of queenly life extended far beyond the dangers of childbirth and court intrigue. Medieval queens faced constant threats to their health from the primitive medical practices of their time, the hazardous nature of their clothing, and the stress of their impossible circumstances. Their bodies became battlegrounds where politics, religion, and survival intersected in ways that would seem unimaginable to us today. The medicine available to medieval queens was a bewildering mixture of folklore, religious ritual, and practices that often did more harm than good. When Queen Isabella of France fell gravely ill in 1358, her physicians prescribed a treatment that included ground pearls, unicorn horn powder, and bloodletting performed during specific phases of the moon. The unicorn horn, of course, was actually narwhal tusk, and the pearls provided no medicinal benefit whatsoever. The bloodletting, performed with unsterilized instruments, likely weakened her further when she needed strength most. Physicians of the era believed that illness stemmed from an imbalance of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. To restore balance, they would prescribe bizarre concoctions that might include everything from crushed beetles to mercury. Queen Philippa of Hainaut, wife of Edward III, suffered from what was likely diabetes, though her doctors had no understanding of the condition. They treated her symptoms with a mixture of ground gold, rosewater, and the rendered fat of a white hart, believing that the purity of these ingredients would restore her health. The very clothing that marked queens as royalty also posed serious health risks. The elaborate gowns they wore were often incredibly heavy, sometimes weighing 40 pounds or more when fully adorned with jewels, gold thread, and ermine trim. The tight-fitting bodices, designed to create the fashionable silhouette of the era, compressed internal organs and made breathing difficult. Many queens suffered from chronic back pain and digestive issues that were direct results of their restrictive clothing. Lead-based cosmetics were another silent killer in the medieval court. The pale, ethereal complexion that was considered the height of beauty required the use of white face paints that contained deadly amounts of lead. Queen Elizabeth I, though from a later period, exemplified the dangers of these beauty standards. Her famous white complexion was achieved through the use of a mixture called Venetian ceruse, which contained lead and vinegar. Over time, this poisoned her skin and likely contributed to her eventual decline. The stress of queenly life manifested in ways that medieval medicine was utterly unprepared to address. Queen Isabella of Castile developed what modern doctors would recognize as severe anxiety and depression brought on by the impossible pressures of her position. Her symptoms included insomnia, loss of appetite, and periods of intense melancholy that could last for weeks. Her physicians, lacking any understanding of mental health, prescribed pilgrimages and increased prayer as cures, believing her condition to be a spiritual failing rather than a medical one. Medieval queens also faced unique dangers from assassination attempts, often through poison. The fear of being poisoned was so pervasive that many queens employed food tasters and kept detailed records of their meals. Queen Joan of Navarre, stepmother to Henry V, lived in constant fear after being accused of attempting to poison the king through witchcraft. Though the charges were likely fabricated for political reasons, the stress of the accusation and subsequent imprisonment severely damaged her health. The emotional toll of queenly life was perhaps even more devastating than the physical dangers. Medieval queens lived in a state of emotional isolation that few could truly understand. Surrounded by hundreds of courtiers, they were often profoundly lonely, unable to form genuine friendships or trust anyone completely. Every relationship was potentially political. Every confidence shared could be used as a weapon. Queen Margaret of Anjou, wife of the mentally ill Henry VI, found herself thrust into a role she never expected when her husband's condition made him unable to rule effectively. She became the de facto ruler of England, making enemies of powerful nobles who resented being governed by a woman. The stress of trying to hold the kingdom together while protecting her husband and young son took a tremendous toll. Contemporary accounts describe her as aging rapidly, her hair turning white and her face becoming gaunt from the constant strain. The loneliness was compounded by the fact that queens were often far from their birth families, married into foreign courts where they might not even speak the language fluently. Queen Anne of Bohemia, wife of Richard II, was just 15 when she arrived in England, speaking no English and knowing no one. Letters from the period reveal her desperate homesickness and her struggle to adapt to English customs that seemed strange and sometimes barbaric to her. Even their relationships with their children were complicated by political considerations. Queens could rarely simply be mothers. They had to be strategic parents, constantly aware of how their children's marriages and alliances would affect the kingdom's future. Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine loved her children fiercely, but she also used them as political pawns, arranging marriages and alliances that served her interests even when they caused her children pain. The pressure to maintain perfect behavior at all times was emotionally exhausting. Queens could never have a bad day, never lose their temper, never show weakness or uncertainty. They had to be perpetually gracious, wise, and composed, even when facing betrayal, loss, or personal tragedy. This constant performance of perfection took a psychological toll that few could sustain indefinitely. Many queens turned to religion as their primary source of emotional support. But even this refuge was complicated by political considerations. Their devotions were scrutinized for political implications. Their choice of confessor could affect international relations, and their religious practices had to align with the kingdom's political needs. Queen Catherine of Aragon found solace in her deep Catholic faith, but this same faith ultimately led to her downfall when Henry VIII sought to divorce her. The few queens who managed to find some measure of emotional fulfillment often did so through patronage of the arts, scholarship, or charitable works. These activities allowed them to exercise some degree of personal choice and to create lasting legacies beyond their political roles. Queen Philippa of Hainaut found joy in supporting poets and musicians, creating a brilliant court culture that outlasted her own life. Yet even in their darkest moments, many medieval queens displayed remarkable resilience and strength. They adapted to impossible circumstances, found ways to exercise influence despite legal restrictions, and often managed to protect their children and secure their dynasties against overwhelming odds. Their stories reveal not just the brutal realities of medieval royal life, but also the extraordinary capacity of the human spirit to endure and even triumph in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges. The legacy of these remarkable women extends far beyond their individual stories. They challenged contemporary notions of female capability, demonstrated that women could be effective rulers and political actors, and laid groundwork for future generations of queens who would wield power more openly. Their suffering was real and often devastating, but their strength and resilience in the face of that suffering created precedents that would echo through history, slowly expanding the possibilities for women in positions of power and authority. Boring history, what life was really like for medieval queens. Yet perhaps the most profound tragedy of medieval queenship was the way it could trap a woman between irreconcilable loyalties. A queen was expected to be devoted to her husband and his kingdom, but also to serve as a diplomatic bridge to her birth family and homeland. When conflicts arose between these allegiances, queens found themselves in impossible positions, forced to choose between the men who had shaped their lives and the political necessities of their adopted realms. Eleanor of Aquitaine faced such a dilemma when her sons rebelled against their father, Henry II of England. As both mother and queen, she was torn between maternal instinct and wifely duty. Her decision to support her sons led to her imprisonment for 16 years, a punishment that speaks to the dangerous tightrope medieval queens walked between competing loyalties. These divided allegiances were particularly acute for foreign-born queens, who often faced suspicion and hostility from their new subjects. When military conflicts erupted between their birth countries and adopted kingdoms, these women became convenient scapegoats for political failures. Isabella of France, married to Edward II of England, found herself blamed for the kingdom's military defeats against her native France, despite having no real influence over either country's military strategies. The children of such unions often became pawns in these loyalty conflicts. Queens watched helplessly as their offspring were used as diplomatic tools, sent away as hostages, or forced into marriages that served political rather than personal interests. The maternal bond, which should have been a source of comfort and joy, became another arena of political manipulation and heartbreak. Medieval medical understanding was primitive at best, and queens suffered from the same limited knowledge that affected all women of their era, though their treatments were often more elaborate and sometimes more dangerous. Court physicians, eager to demonstrate their skills and justify their positions, frequently subjected royal patients to experimental treatments that did more harm than good. Bloodletting was considered a cure-all for everything from headaches to difficult pregnancies. Queens endured regular sessions where leeches were applied to their skin or their veins were opened with crude instruments, These procedures, performed in unsanitary conditions, often led to infections and weakened their already fragile constitutions. The preparation of royal medicines involved exotic and often toxic ingredients. Mercury, lead, and arsenic were common components in remedies designed to treat everything from melancholy to menstrual irregularities. Powdered unicorn horn, though actually rhinoceros horn or narwhal tusk, was prescribed for its supposed magical healing properties. These expensive treatments gave the illusion of superior care while often poisoning the very women they were meant to heal. Pregnancy brought its own medical horrors. Queens were subjected to bizarre rituals designed to ensure safe delivery and male offspring. They wore amulets made from peculiar substances, consumed concoctions of ground pearls and gold leaf, and endured examinations by midwives whose knowledge was based more on superstition than understanding of human anatomy. When complications arose during childbirth, the primitive surgical techniques available often proved fatal. Caesarean sections were performed without anesthesia or proper sterilization, usually only as a last resort when the mother was already dying. The survival rate for such procedures was virtually zero, making every difficult birth a potential death sentence. The constant cycle of pregnancy and nursing took a devastating toll on queens' bodies. Without understanding of nutrition or proper prenatal care, many suffered from conditions that would be easily preventable today. Anemia, calcium deficiency, and various complications from repeated pregnancies left many queens as invalids long before their time. Mental health was perhaps the most misunderstood aspect of medieval medicine. Queens suffering from what we might recognize today as depression, anxiety, or postpartum disorders were often diagnosed with hysteria or possession by evil spirits. Treatments ranged from prayer and fasting to exorcisms and physical restraint. Joanna of Castile, known as Joanna the Mad, exemplifies the tragic misunderstanding of mental illness in medieval times. Her grief over her husband's death, combined with what appears to have been severe depression or bipolar disorder, was interpreted as madness. She was confined and declared unfit to rule, her legitimate emotional responses pathologized and used to justify her political marginalization. The isolation of queenship often exacerbated mental health issues. Cut off from family support systems and surrounded by courtiers with their own agendas, queens had few outlets for genuine emotional expression. The constant pressure to maintain a perfect facade while dealing with personal trauma created a psychological burden that many found unbearable. Sleep disorders were common among medieval queens, caused by the stress of their positions and the uncomfortable conditions of medieval life. Their elaborate beds, while symbols of status, were often infested with parasites and provided little actual comfort. The heavy fabrics and multiple layers of bedding created suffocating environments that disrupted natural sleep patterns. The queen's daily routines were so rigid and demanding that they left little time for rest or recuperation. From dawn prayers to evening entertainments, every moment was scheduled and supervised. This relentless pace, combined with the emotional stress of their positions, created a perfect storm for physical and mental exhaustion. Skin conditions were rampant among medieval nobility, including queens due to the heavy cosmetics and elaborate dress required by their stations. Lead-based face paints caused serious poisoning over time, while the tight lacing of corsets and the weight of elaborate headdresses created physical discomfort and health problems. The very clothing that marked queens as royal also endangered their health and safety. Heavy fabrics and long trains made movement difficult and dangerous, particularly around the open fires that heated medieval castles. Many noble women died in fires when their elaborate gowns caught flame, trapped by the very symbols of their elevated status. Dental health was universally poor in medieval times, but queens faced unique challenges. Their access to sugar and exotic foods while a mark of privilege led to severe tooth decay. The painful process of tooth extraction, performed without anesthesia, was a regular ordeal that many queens endured multiple times throughout their lives. The herbs and spices available to royal kitchens, while flavorful, were often contaminated or adulterated. Queens consumed foods that had traveled great distances without proper preservation, leading to food poisoning and digestive disorders. The elaborate presentation of royal meals often disguised the poor quality of ingredients underneath. Despite their elevated status, medieval queens were ultimately subject to the same biological realities as all women of their era. Their royal blood offered no protection against the diseases, complications, and medical ignorance that claimed so many lives in the medieval world. If anything, their positions often made them more vulnerable to experimental treatments and dangerous procedures justified by their supposed special status. The legacy of these medical challenges extended beyond individual suffering to shape the very institution of queenship itself. The high mortality rates among royal women influenced succession laws, marriage negotiations, and political alliances. Kingdoms rose and fell, partly based on the reproductive success and survival of their queens, making women's health a matter of state importance while providing little actual protection or care for the women themselves. As we reflect on the medical realities faced by medieval queens, we see how their suffering was often hidden behind the glamour of court life and royal privilege. Their pain was private, while their failures were public, creating a double burden that few could bear with grace. Their stories remind us that behind every crown was a human being, vulnerable to the same frailties that affect us all, but with far less freedom to acknowledge or address their suffering. In our modern world of advanced medicine and women's rights, it's difficult to imagine the helplessness these women must have felt, trapped in bodies that were both revered and endangered by their royal status. Their courage in facing these challenges, often without complaint or support, speaks to a strength of character that transcends their historical moment and continues to inspire us today. The medieval queens who survived these medical ordeals did so through a combination of luck, determination, and the kind of resilience that can only be forged in the crucible of extreme adversity. Their endurance in the face of such challenges reminds us that true nobility lies not in titles or crowns, but in the human capacity to persevere against overwhelming odds, finding dignity and purpose even in the darkest of circumstances.